The emergency beacon screamed across every frequency known to galactic civilization. Red warnings flashed on screens from the crystalline towers of Altair Prime to the floating cities of the gas giant Nexus. Every species in the galaxy heard the same terrifying message repeated in 1,000 languages. The Devourers had awakened. Ambassador Krell of the Thanari Empire stood before the emergency council session, his forearms trembling as he delivered the report. His people had been the first to encounter these ancient horrors, and barely 3 ships had escaped to tell the tale. The creatures were unlike anything in their databases. They consumed light itself, leaving systems in absolute darkness. Entire planets simply vanished, not destroyed, but erased from existence as if they had never been. 12 civilizations in 30 days, Krell announced to the packed chamber. The Morven Collective gone. The bright suns of Kappa extinct. The machine intelligence of Grid 7 silent forever. His voice cracked with each name. These were not small settlements, but major galactic powers with billions of citizens and fleets that could crack planets. The council erupted in panic. Species that had warred for centuries suddenly forgot their differences as they faced extinction. The insectoid hive queens buzzed in harmonic terror. The energy beings of Zeta Reticuli flickered with fear. Even the ancient rock people of Titan's Belt, who moved so slowly they measured time in millennia, began rapid preparations to flee their ancestral homes. But one delegation sat in complete silence. The human representatives occupied a small section near the back of the chamber. Admiral Thompson, a weathered woman with gray hair, listened to the reports without expression. Dr. Rodriguez sat beside her, taking notes on a simple tablet. The third member of their delegation, Ambassador Price, watched the chaos with calm interest, like a scientist observing an experiment. The Devourers move in a pattern, Krell continued, his voice rising over the din. They follow energy signatures. The brighter the civilization, the faster they approach. We estimate they will reach the core worlds within 6 months. Every species must evacuate immediately. We must scatter to the dark regions between galaxies and hope they lose interest. The Thanari ambassador's eyes fell on the human delegation. The creatures approach your solar system next, he said directly to Thompson. Your species has perhaps 40 days before they arrive. We have prepared evacuation ships for your people. Thompson stood slowly. The chamber fell quiet, waiting for humanity's response to the death sentence they had just received. She was not impressive compared to the other species present. No chitinous armor like the Hive Queens, no energy manipulation like the Zeta beings, no massive size like the Titans, just an ordinary woman in a simple uniform. We appreciate the offer, Thompson said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, but humanity will remain in our system. The silence stretched for long seconds. Then the chamber exploded in voices. Species shouted warnings in their native tongues. The universal translator struggled to keep up with the overlapping protests. They called humans insane, suicidal, foolishly brave. Some offered additional evacuation assistance. Others began writing them off as already dead. Krell held up his hands for quiet. Admiral Thompson, you do not understand. These are not invaders. You can fight. They are entropy made manifest. They do not negotiate, they do not retreat, they do not show mercy. They simply consume until nothing remains. We understand. Dr. Rodriguez spoke for the first time, her voice soft but clear. We've reviewed all the data you've provided. We've run our own analyses. The Devourers are indeed formidable. Then why stay? Demanded Queen Zack of the Northern Hive. Her mandibles clicked in agitation. Why choose death when you could live? Ambassador Price finally spoke. Because running won't save anyone. Not in the long term. He gestured to the star maps displayed around the chamber. These creatures have existed since before our civilizations began. They sleep between galaxies for millions of years, then wake hungry. If we scatter now, they'll simply hunt us down one by one across the cosmos. Eventually, there will be nowhere left to run. The chamber fell silent again. It was Queen Zack who finally spoke. You have a plan. We have an idea, Thompson replied. But it requires everyone else to leave the galaxy, at least temporarily. Your energy signatures, your technology, your very presence will interfere with what we need to do. What you need to do is die uselessly, Krell snapped. I have seen what these creatures can do. They stripped our homeworld of its light in minutes. Our sun still burns, but no warmth reaches the surface. Our people freeze in eternal darkness while the star above them becomes a cold, distant point. Thompson nodded. That's exactly what we need to understand. How they feed, how they move, how they choose their targets. She looked around the chamber at the assembled representatives of galactic civilization. You've all been reacting with fear, which is understandable. But fear makes you miss details. Fear makes you run instead of observe. Dr. Rodriguez stood beside her. In our history, humanity has faced extinction before. Ice ages, supervolcano eruptions, asteroid impacts, plagues that killed most of our population. We learned something important from those experiences. Sometimes the key to survival isn't fighting or fleeing. Sometimes it's learning to be very, very still. The delegation from the crystal hegemony chimed like broken bells. Stillness will not save you from entities that devour light itself. Maybe not, Price admitted, but panic certainly won't save anyone. Look at your own records. Every species that encountered the devourers did the same thing. They powered up their defenses, broadcast distress signals, ran their engines at maximum output, filled space with energy signatures trying to escape. And every single one drew the creatures directly to them. The human delegation began gathering their materials. Thompson looked once more around the chamber. We're not asking anyone else to stay. We're not asking anyone to sacrifice themselves. We're asking you to give us time to try something different. Take your people to the dark regions as planned, but don't go too far. If we succeed, you'll want to come back. If we fail, at least you'll survive to try again somewhere else. As the humans prepared to leave, Krell called out, How long? Thompson paused at the chamber exit. How long for what? How long do we wait before we know if you succeeded or failed? She considered the question. Give us a year. If the devourers are still active after 1 year, assume we failed, and keep running. The chamber doors closed behind the human delegation, leaving the representatives of 1,000 worlds to contemplate the choice before them. Some immediately began evacuation preparations. Others lingered, studying the data the humans had shared. A few began quietly making preparations of their own, planning to observe from a safe distance. Within hours, the great exodus began. Ships launched from every inhabited world as entire civilizations packed their most precious possessions and fled toward the galactic rim. The ancient migration routes, unused for millions of years, filled with refugee fleets. Behind them, lights began going dark as worlds were abandoned. But in the Sol system, humanity began their own preparations. Not for evacuation, but for the strangest experiment in their species' history. As the rest of the galaxy burned with the light of fleeing engines, human settlements began systematically dimming their own lights. Cities that had blazed like stars for centuries started to fade. Ships powered down to minimal signatures. Even Earth's orbital stations reduced their energy output to barely detectable levels. The galaxy watched in fascination and horror as humanity began to disappear, not through flight, but through silence. It was a silence that would either save them, all or become their tomb. The first signs appeared at the edge of the solar system like a cancer spreading through space itself. Captain Rivers watched from the observation deck of his merchant vessel, the Silent Dawn, as Pluto's weak sunlight simply stopped reaching its surface. The distant planet didn't explode or burn. It just became invisible, as if someone had painted it black with the darkest paint imaginable. Rivers had volunteered for this mission despite his family's protests. He was 53 years old, had spent 30 years hauling cargo between the outer colonies and had never considered himself particularly brave. But when humanity's scientific council asked for volunteers to observe the devourers firsthand, something inside him had responded. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was stupidity. He wasn't sure there was a difference anymore. Contact lost with Neptune Station, reported his communications officer, Maria Santos. Her voice remained steady, but Rivers could see her hands shaking slightly as she worked her console. They sent one final transmission, just said the lights went out everywhere at once. The Silent Dawn drifted in powered-down mode near the asteroid belt, running on minimal life support. Every non-essential system had been shut down. The ship moved through space like a piece of debris, cold and apparently lifeless. This was the plan humanity had developed after studying every report from the fleeing galactic civilizations. Be small, be quiet, be uninteresting. Dr. Lisa Chen floated near the main observation window, making notes on a paper tablet. Paper, not electronic. Even the tiny energy signature of a digital device might be enough to draw attention they couldn't afford. She had been Earth's leading expert on exotic physics before the crisis began. Now she was humanity's best hope of understanding what they faced. The phenomenon is moving inward at approximately 15% of light speed, she whispered to Rivers. It's not random. There's definitely intelligence behind the movement pattern. Through the reinforced window, they watched something that defied every natural law they understood. The darkness wasn't just absence of light. It moved, with purpose, flowing around objects like liquid shadow. When it touched anything with an energy signature above background levels, that object simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. They had watched it consume an automated mining platform on Ceres. The platform had been running standard operations, its fusion reactor powering extraction equipment. The moment the darkness reached it, the platform didn't explode or get crushed. It became nothing. Not destroyed, not disassembled, just edited out of reality, as if it had never existed. Movement detected, Santos whispered, pointing toward the inner system. Something big approaching Jupiter. Rivers felt his breath catch in his throat. The thing approaching Jupiter was enormous beyond comprehension. It moved like a living mountain of pure void, easily the size of Earth's moon. As it neared the gas giant, Jupiter's brilliant aurora displays began to fade. The radiation belts that had surrounded the planet for billions of years simply vanished, their energy absorbed by the creature. But Jupiter itself survived. The planet continued orbiting, its moons intact, its great red spot still swirling in the atmosphere. The devourer had fed on the planet's energy emissions but left the physical matter alone. It was like watching a predator that only ate the life force of its prey, leaving empty shells behind. It's learning our system, Chen observed, making more notes. Testing energy levels, mapping sources. The smaller creatures are scouts. Rivers nodded, watching smaller shadows flow around Jupiter's moons. Europa Station had gone dark hours ago, but the moon itself remained untouched. Only the artificial structures, the technology, the concentrated energy sources had disappeared. The natural world continued unchanged. That gave him hope. His communicator crackled with an encrypted transmission from Earth. Silent Dawn, this is Control. Status report. Still here, Rivers replied quietly. The phenomena are definitely intelligent. They distinguish between natural and artificial energy sources. They're also incredibly patient. No rush, no aggressive expansion. They're taking time to understand what they're consuming. Copy that. How long until they reach Earth? Rivers looked at Chen, who held up 5 fingers. 5 days, maybe 6, he said. The main body is still examining Jupiter, but the scouts are moving ahead. Understood. Continue observation. Remember, no active scans, no transmissions above whisper level. Acknowledged Control. Silent Dawn out. Rivers ended the transmission and returned to watching the impossible scene before them. Mars was next in the creature's path, and humanity had spent the last month preparing for this moment. Every settlement on the red planet had powered down to absolute minimum. The terraforming stations were running on stored power only. Even the orbital mirrors that provided extra sunlight had been folded and stored. When the darkness reached Mars, 3 days later, Rivers watched through binoculars as scouts flowed across the planet's surface like black water. They investigated every human structure, every dome, every vehicle. But finding only minimal energy signatures, they moved on without consuming anything. The settlements remained intact, their inhabitants hiding in the dark, breathing recycled air and eating cold food. They're testing us, Chen whispered with growing excitement. Look at the movement patterns. They're checking to see if we're truly dormant or just hiding. She was right. The scouts returned to several locations, lingering near the largest settlements. They seemed to be waiting for some response, some sign that the humans were still active. But the colonists had trained for this. Every person on Mars sat in perfect stillness, controlling even their breathing to minimize heat signatures. After 6 hours of investigation, the scouts departed. Mars remained untouched. The main body of devourers continued its slow approach toward Earth. Rivers repositioned the Silent Dawn, using minimal thruster bursts to stay ahead of the advancing darkness. They needed to observe the creature's reaction to humanity's home planet, where 8 billion people were attempting the largest coordinated silence in history. As they approached the inner system, Rivers received updates from the global communication network. Every city on Earth had reduced power consumption by 90%. Streetlights were dark. Skyscrapers stood like black monoliths against the night sky. Even essential services ran on backup power, producing heat signatures barely above natural. Background levels. The space stations around Earth had been the greatest challenge. These facilities needed constant power to maintain life support and orbital position. But human engineers had found solutions that amazed even themselves. They developed passive heat management systems that required no active cooling. They created mechanical air recycling that worked without electric pumps. They redesigned gravity, generation to use the planet's own magnetic field instead of power cores. From space, Earth looked like it had reverted to pre-industrial levels of energy output. Contact with Luna Base, Santos reported. They confirm all systems nominal, population holding steady in silence protocols. The moon had been transformed into humanity's observation post. Hidden in the shadows of deep craters, teams of scientists watched the approaching darkness with passive sensors. No active radar, no energy emissions that could attract attention. Just human eyes, human instruments, and human patience. As the first Devourer scouts reached Earth's orbit, Rivers found himself holding his breath. This was the moment that would determine whether humanity's plan had any chance of success. Either the creatures would recognize Earth as a living world and consume it, or they would see only another quiet planet and move on. The scouts circled Earth for 12 hours. They investigated the moon, the space stations, the satellite networks. They found minimal energy signatures, systems running at barely detectable levels. After what seemed like an eternity, they departed toward the outer system, apparently satisfied that this region contained nothing worth consuming. Earth had passed the test. Rivers allowed himself to smile for the first time in weeks. Humanity had learned to be invisible to predators that hunted by energy signature. They had mastered the art of cosmic camouflage. But this was only the beginning. The real challenge would come when the main body of devourers arrived. Creatures, so massive and ancient that they might not be fooled by simple tricks of silence. As the Silent Dawn continued its lonely watch, Rivers wondered if humanity's greatest strength would prove to be their ability to simply wait. While the rest of the galaxy fled in panic, humans had chosen to remain still and learn. It was a gamble that would either save everyone or doom them. All but for now they were still alive, still learning, and still hidden in the vast darkness between worlds. 3 months after the galaxy went dark, Tom Bailey sat on his porch watching his wheat grow in the pale morning light. Above him, a creature the size of a battleship drifted silently across the sky of New Terra, its impossible form blotting out stars as it moved. Tom didn't look up. He'd learned that looking up, tensing with fear, or even thinking too hard about the things above could somehow attract their attention. Instead, he focused on the simple task of sharpening his scythe. With a whetstone, the repetitive scraping sound was oddly comforting in the silence that had settled over the galaxy. His cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, apparently unaware that death itself floated overhead. Animals, Tom had discovered, were naturally better at this than humans. They didn't generate the complex energy patterns that seemed to draw the devourer's interest. His neighbor Ellen walked past on the dirt road, carrying a basket of vegetables from her garden. She nodded to Tom, but didn't speak. Conversations were limited to whispers now, and only when absolutely necessary. Even their thoughts had to be kept simple, focused on basic tasks rather than complex emotions or abstract ideas. The morning routine continued as it had every day for the past 90 days. Tom fed his chickens by hand, pumped water from the well, using a manual handle, and tended his crops with tools that required no power beyond human muscle. It was like living in Earth's 19th century, except with the constant knowledge that alien horrors circled overhead. The global communication network still functioned, but barely. Messages traveled through fiber optic cables buried deep underground, carrying only essential information. Tom received his daily update through a hand-cranked radio that picked up low-power broadcasts from the regional center. The news was always the same. Humanity endures. The Watchers continue to pass by, maintain silence protocols. But the news from beyond human space told a different story. The Kristak Empire had attempted to establish a hidden base in the Void Nebula, thinking the dense gas clouds would mask their energy signatures. The Devourers had found them within days, drawn by the quantum resonance of their FTL drives. 2 billion crystalline beings, each one a living work of art that took centuries to mature, had been consumed in minutes. The machine intelligence known, as the grid had tried to scatter its consciousness across millions of small drones, hoping to become too distributed to attract attention. But even the minimal processing power of each drone was enough to create a detectable pattern. The Devourers had methodically hunted down every fragment until the grid fell silent forever. Most heartbreaking was the fate of the Nurari, a peaceful species that communicated through bioluminescent patterns on their skin. They had tried to evacuate to the dark regions between galaxies, but their very biology betrayed them. They couldn't help but glow when frightened or excited, and their terror at the approaching darkness made them shine like beacons. The refugee ships were found drifting empty, their hulls intact but every living thing aboard simply gone. Tom finished sharpening his scythe and stood slowly, his joints creaking after 3 months of manual labor. He was a former Starship engineer who had spent 40 years working with fusion reactors and quantum computers. Now he lived like his great-grandfather had, relying on tools that had changed little in centuries. The irony wasn't lost on him, but he didn't dwell on it. Complex thoughts were dangerous now. His daughter Amy emerged from the farmhouse carrying their infant son. She moved with the fluid grace that all humans had learned over the past months, each step deliberate and economical. Wasted motion created heat signatures. Unnecessary effort generated bioelectric activity. Even breathing had to be controlled, deep and slow rather than quick and shallow. Amy had been a quantum physicist before the crisis, working on experimental FTL drives that could theoretically fold space-time. Now she spent her days making cheese, from their cow's milk, and preserving vegetables for the winter they might not live to see. But she did it with the same methodical precision she had once applied to mathematical equations, and Tom could see that the discipline was keeping her sane. The baby, little Ben, was perhaps the most remarkable of them all. Born just weeks before, the Devourers arrived. He had never known a world of electronic entertainment, bright lights, or constant noise. He rarely cried, seeming to understand instinctively that silence was survival. When he did make sounds, they were soft gurgles and whispers that barely registered above background levels. Across the village, other families followed similar routines. The blacksmith hammered metal using a coal forge that had been lit once and never extinguished, producing a steady low heat rather than the intense bursts that powered forges once used. The baker kneaded bread by hand in quantities just large enough to feed the village, working with ingredients grown locally to avoid the energy cost of transportation. Children played games that would have seemed impossibly quiet to previous generations. Tag became a slow-motion dance where players moved like shadows. Hide-and-seek turned into exercises in absolute stillness that could last for hours. They learned to read using books printed on paper, studying by candlelight in the evening hours. The most remarkable adaptation was in their communication. Humans had developed an elaborate system of hand signals and facial expressions that conveyed complex ideas without sound. Couples could have entire conversations with subtle gestures. Mothers could comfort crying children with touches and expressions that were more effective than words had ever been. Tom walked through his wheat field, checking each plant with the careful attention his grandfather had once given to starship sensors. The grain was growing well despite the constant twilight that now covered most human worlds. They had learned to work with reduced sunlight, selecting crop varieties that thrived in dim conditions. Above him, the massive devourer continued its slow patrol of the upper atmosphere. Tom had nicknamed it the Shepherd, because it seemed to circle the planet like a dog watching sheep. But unlike a dog, it showed no interest in the life below, unless that life became too energetic, too noticeable, too alive in ways the creature could detect and desire. Dr. Rodriguez had visited the village 2 weeks ago, traveling on foot from the regional science center. She had whispered her findings to the village council in a meeting lit by a single candle. The devourers, she reported, were not simple predators. They were more like cosmic gardeners, pruning away civilizations that grew too bright, too fast, too energetically intense for the galaxy to sustain. The entities had been doing this for billions of years, she believed. They slept between galaxies, until the local civilizations reached a certain threshold of energy output, then awakened to reset the cosmic balance. Most species reached that threshold quickly, once they achieved spaceflight, their technology growing exponentially, until they blazed like stars in the darkness. But humanity had chosen a different path. Instead of burning brighter, they had learned to burn smaller. Instead of expanding their energy use, they had contracted it. Instead of fighting the cosmic cycle, they were trying to slip beneath its notice. It was a survival strategy no other species had attempted, because it required something most civilizations considered impossible: voluntary technological regression. Tom reached the end of his field and turned back toward the farmhouse. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from a few chimneys, carefully dispersed and minimal. The village looked like something from centuries past, but it was still alive, still human, still enduring while the galaxy burned around them. As he walked, Tom allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. Humanity had faced extinction before and survived by adapting, by changing, by becoming something new when the old ways no longer worked. They had learned to make fire in ice ages, to grow food in deserts, to find water on waterless worlds. Now they were learning to live in silence while cosmic forces raged overhead. The sun was setting as Tom reached his porch. Amy had prepared dinner over their wood stove, a simple meal of vegetables and bread that would have seemed primitive 3 months ago. Now it tasted like the most delicious food in the galaxy, because they were still alive to eat it. Above them, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Some were dimmer than they used to be, their light consumed by the creatures that now owned the space between worlds, but they were still there, still burning, still proving that even in the vast darkness, small lights could endure. Tom sat on his porch as night fell, listening to the quiet sounds of his sleeping village. Somewhere, in the distance, an owl called softly. His cattle shifted in their paddock. Amy hummed a lullaby to their son, so quietly it was barely audible even from a few feet away. It was the sound of humanity learning to survive by becoming smaller, quieter, more patient than they had ever been before. And in that silence, Tom began to believe they might actually succeed. Dr. Rodriguez stood in the underground laboratory beneath Luna Base, surrounded by calculations that covered every available surface. The walls were lined with equations written in chalk, diagrams sketched on paper, and models built from simple materials that generated no electronic signatures. After 6 months of observation and analysis, she finally understood what they were fighting. The devourers were not evil. They were not invaders or destroyers in any conventional sense. They were maintenance systems, cosmic antibodies designed to prevent any single galaxy from burning too bright and disrupting the delicate balance of the universe. When civilizations reached a critical mass of energy output, the devourers awakened to restore equilibrium. But every system had limits. Every mechanism could be overwhelmed or satisfied. Her assistant David carefully entered the chamber carrying a tray of equipment built from purely mechanical components. springs, levers, and clockwork mechanisms that could perform complex calculations without generating detectable energy signatures. They looked like artifacts from humanity's industrial past, but they were the most sophisticated tools available in their current situation. "The probes are ready," David whispered, setting the tray on a wooden table. 17 units, each one, designed to create what you called entropy wells. Rodriguez picked up one of the devices, examining its elegant simplicity. It looked like a metallic seed pod about the size of a human fist, covered in intricate mechanical patterns. When activated by a simple clockwork timer, it would unfold into a complex array of precisely positioned materials that created zones of absolute stillness. Not just quiet, but true entropy, where even quantum fluctuations slowed to near zero levels. "The theory is sound," she said, more to convince herself than David. "The devourers feed on energy, but they're also attracted to it. If we can create spaces that are more empty than empty space itself, more void than the void between galaxies, they should be drawn to investigate. And once they enter these zones, they fall asleep," David finished, "like a predator that finds the perfect cave for hibernation." Rodriguez nodded. The calculations suggested that devourers were not naturally active. They preferred dormancy, awakening only when cosmic energy levels exceeded tolerable limits. If they could create artificial environments that satisfied the creature's need for emptiness, the ancient beings might settle into sleep voluntarily. It was the most dangerous gamble in human history. Above them, Captain Rivers prepared the Silent Dawn for its final mission. The merchant ship had been transformed over the past months, stripped of every unnecessary system, and equipped with purely mechanical controls. The navigation computer had been replaced with mechanical calculators. The life support ran on compressed air and chemical scrubbers. Even the pilot's chairs were adjusted by hand cranks rather than electric motors. Rivers reviewed his crew one final time. Maria Santos had volunteered to remain as communications officer, operating equipment that worked through physical switches and mechanical amplifiers. Engineer Paul Kim had designed backup systems using steam pressure and hydraulic controls. Dr. Chen would monitor the mission using instruments that recorded data on paper rather than digital storage. They were joined by volunteers from 17 other ships, each one converted to run on minimal power signatures. The entire fleet looked like something from humanity's early space age, but they were capable of reaching the galactic core where the main concentration of devourers now fed on the energy of stars themselves. The launch came at midnight Earth time, coordinated across human space to minimize detectable signatures. Ships lifted off using chemical rockets rather than fusion drives. Their exhaust dispersed through atmospheric layers to avoid creating bright plumes that might attract attention. The acceleration was gentle, almost lazy compared to modern standards, but it was enough to reach their destination. As they traveled toward the galactic core, the fleet maintained absolute communication silence. Each ship followed a predetermined course calculated to avoid areas where devourer activity had been detected. They moved like ghosts through space, leaving no trace of their passage. The journey took 3 weeks. Rivers spent the time reviewing the mission parameters and trying not to think about the odds of survival. They were carrying 17 experimental devices into the heart of territory, controlled by entities that could erase matter from existence. If the entropy wells failed to work as designed, the entire fleet would simply vanish without even leaving debris behind. But the theory was elegant in its simplicity. The devourers consumed energy because energy represented chaos, disorder, the kind of cosmic noise that interfered with universal harmony. If they could provide the creatures with perfect order, perfect silence, perfect emptiness, then perhaps the ancient beings would choose sleep over destruction. The first sign of their destination appeared as a region of space where stars seemed dimmed, their light filtered through massive forms that moved between them. The devourers had gathered at the galactic core in numbers that defied comprehension. Hundreds of entities, each the size of moons, drifted between star systems, feeding on stellar radiation and reducing the galaxy's energy output by measurable percentages. Rivers felt his breath catch as he observed the creatures through passive telescopes. Up close, they were even more impossible than the reports had suggested. They moved like living shadows, but shadows with purpose and intelligence. Some appeared to communicate with others through patterns of darkness that flowed between them like slow lightning. They were beautiful in their alien majesty, even as they represented extinction for every other form of life in the galaxy. The fleet approached the edge of Devourer territory and began deploying the entropy wells, according to Rodriguez's calculations. Each device was released on a trajectory that would carry it into the heart of the creature swarm. The clockwork timers were set to activate the wells at staggered intervals, creating a cascade of emptiness that should draw the Devourer's attention without triggering their defensive responses. Rivers watched the first probe activate through his telescope, its mechanical components unfolding in a complex dance of gears and springs. The device created something that human science barely had words for, a region where entropy approached theoretical maximum, where even the quantum vacuum fell silent. It was more absent than the space between galaxies, more still than the pause between heartbeats. The nearest devourer noticed immediately. The massive entity turned with liquid grace, its attention drawn to this new source of perfect emptiness. It approached the entropy well like a curious cat investigating something unusual, extending tendrils of living shadow to examine the phenomenon. When those tendrils touched the zone of absolute stillness, the creature's entire form seemed to relax. More devourers began to converge on the first probe, drawn by whatever satisfaction it provided. A second entropy well activated, then a third, creating overlapping zones of cosmic quiet that seemed to calm the ancient beings. One by one, the massive creatures settled into positions around the wells like flowers turning toward sunlight. But instead of feeding on the devices, they began to synchronize with them. The devourers' forms grew less active, their movements slower and more deliberate. The patterns of shadow that flowed between them shifted from active communication to something that resembled the slow rhythms of deep sleep. As more entropy wells activated, more creatures joined the growing cluster of dormant entities. Rivers realized he was holding his breath. The plan was working. The devourers weren't being trapped or destroyed, they were choosing to sleep, drawn to the artificial emptiness like tired travelers finding perfect beds after a long journey. The entropy wells provided something they had been seeking without knowing it, spaces of absolute peace in a galaxy that had become too noisy for rest. Within hours, the entire swarm had gathered around the 17 entropy wells. The massive creatures arranged themselves in complex patterns that somehow amplified the effect of the devices, creating vast regions of cosmic stillness. Stars that had been dimmed by their feeding began to shine more brightly, as the devourers stopped actively consuming stellar radiation. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Beings that had terrorized the galaxy for months were now settling into hibernation like ancient guardians returning to their posts after completing a long patrol. They didn't disappear or die. They simply became part of the cosmic architecture, sleeping sentinels that would presumably awaken again when the galaxy's energy levels rose too high. Rivers allowed himself to smile as he watched the last of the great creatures settle into dormancy. Humanity had succeeded not through violence or superior technology, but through understanding and patience. They had recognized that the devourers served a cosmic purpose, and found a way to satisfy that purpose without sacrificing galactic civilization. The Silent Dawn and its companion ships began their long journey home, carrying news that would transform how the galaxy understood survival. Behind them, the ancient guardians slept peacefully in their artificial caves of emptiness, dreaming whatever dreams such beings might have. The galaxy was safe, at least for now, and humanity had proven once again that sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting harder, but from thinking deeper and waiting longer than anyone else believed possible. As they traveled back, toward human space, Rivers reflected on what they had accomplished. They had faced cosmic forces beyond imagination and prevailed not through conquest, but through comprehension. It was perhaps the most human solution possible, turning potential destroyers into sleeping guardians through the simple gift of perfect rest. The long watch was finally over. Now came the longer task of teaching the galaxy how to live quietly, enough that the guardians could continue their peaceful sleep. 2 years had passed since the galaxy fell silent, and Ambassador Price stood before the reformed Galactic Council in a chamber that looked vastly different from the one where they had first announced humanity's plan to stay behind. The emergency lighting had been replaced with soft, natural illumination. The massive energy displays that once showed real-time data from across the galaxy now used simple mechanical indicators. Even the universal translator worked through acoustic principles rather than quantum processing. The assembled representatives looked different too. Gone were the energy-intensive environmental suits and technological augmentations that had once defined galactic civilization. The Thanari delegation wore simple robes instead of their traditional power armor. The Hive Queens communicated through subtle pheromone releases rather than electronic harmonics. Even the energy beings of Zeta Reticuli had learned to manifest in dimmer, more stable forms that didn't strain the galaxy's new energy budget. The entropy fields remained stable, Price reported, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet chamber. Our monitoring stations confirm that all 17 devourers continue in dormant state. Stellar energy levels across the core regions have returned to normal, and we've detected no signs of awakening among the entities. Queen Zack of the Northern Hive clicked her mandibles softly, in what humans had learned was an expression of amazed gratitude. Your species accomplished what none of us believed possible. You tamed forces of cosmic destruction through patience and understanding rather than force. Price nodded respectfully. We learned that the Devourers weren't our enemies. They were part of a natural cycle, cosmic gardeners maintaining balance across millions of years. Once we understood their purpose, we could work with them instead of against them. The crystal being resonant spoke in harmonics that barely registered above background levels. But the cost was enormous. Entire civilizations had to abandon technologies they had developed over millennia. We live now as our ancestors did, with tools of metal and stone rather than energy and quantum manipulation. Yet we live, countered Ambassador Krell, his forearms gesturing to encompass the chamber. The Thanari Empire exists because humanity taught us to value existence over advancement. Our people may not travel between stars as easily as before, but they are safe in their homes. It was true. The galaxy had undergone the most dramatic technological regression in recorded history. But civilization had survived. Species that once commanded fusion reactors now relied on solar collectors and wind power. Faster-than-light communication had been replaced by mechanical relay systems that took months to carry messages between star systems. Massive city ships had been abandoned in favor of smaller settlements that barely registered on energy detection systems. But in giving up their bright technologies, galactic civilization had gained something unexpected: sustainability. The frantic pace of exponential growth that had characterized the previous age had been replaced by steady, measured development. Resources were used more efficiently. Populations stabilized at levels their worlds could support indefinitely. Wars became less frequent when the energy cost of large-scale conflict was prohibitive. Price gestured to a mechanical display that showed population statistics across human space. Our own experience has been instructive. Earth's population has grown steadily since we adopted low-energy protocols, but birth rates have stabilized naturally. When survival requires community cooperation and resource conservation, people tend to have children at sustainable rates. Dr. Rodriguez, now serving as humanity's chief scientific advisor to the Council, stood to address the assembly. Her hair had gone gray during the crisis years, but her eyes remained bright with the curiosity that had helped solve the devourer problem. We've learned remarkable things about the relationship between consciousness and energy consumption, she said. Species that live quietly, that focus on internal development rather than external expansion, actually achieve greater psychological satisfaction. The Nurari refugees who survived by learning human meditation techniques report higher happiness levels than their ancestors experienced during their technological peak. The surviving Nerari representative, gentle light upon water, confirmed this with a soft bioluminescent display. Her people had been the most difficult to train in energy conservation because their natural communication method involved light, patterns. But they had learned to express themselves through subtle color shifts that were beautiful without being bright. We discovered that peace is more satisfying than progress. She pulsed softly. Our ancestors burned themselves out trying to achieve ever greater brightness. Now we find joy in the gentle glow of sustainable existence. Price looked around the chamber at representatives of dozens of species that had once commanded galactic empires. They looked simpler now, more natural, but also more content. The desperate competition for resources and territory that had driven galactic politics for millennia had been replaced by cooperative efforts to maintain the delicate balance that kept the devourers sleeping. Humanity has established training centers on 17 worlds, he announced. We're teaching meditation techniques, energy conservation methods, and sustainable technology development to any species that wants to learn. The enrollment requests exceed our capacity to provide instruction. This was perhaps the most remarkable development of all. Humans had become the galaxy's teachers in the art of living quietly. Species that had once viewed humanity as primitive, backwater dwellers now sent their brightest minds to learn how to be still, how to be patient, how to find satisfaction in simplicity. The training centers were marvels of low-energy architecture, built into natural features like caves and hillsides. Students learned to grow food by hand, to craft tools from local materials, to build shelters that worked with natural climate patterns instead of fighting them. But more importantly, they learned to find peace in the pause between thoughts, strength in stillness, and wisdom in waiting. Tom Bailey had become one of the most sought-after instructors, teaching agricultural techniques that required no powered machinery. His little farm on New Terra had become a pilgrimage site for beings from across the galaxy who wanted to understand how humans had learned to live so quietly. He still found it amusing that his greatest contribution to galactic civilization was showing people how to milk cows and harvest grain by hand. Captain Rivers had established the Deep Space Monitoring Service, a fleet of quiet ships that maintained watch over the entropy fields at the galactic core. The service was staffed by volunteers from many species, all trained in the human arts of patience and observation. They reported that the devourers occasionally stirred in their sleep, responding to brief spikes in galactic energy output, but always returned to dormancy when the disturbances faded. The monitoring stations themselves had become places of pilgrimage and meditation. Beings who wanted to understand the deeper mysteries of cosmic balance would spend months in the silent observation posts, watching over the sleeping giants that had once terrorized the galaxy. Many reported profound spiritual experiences, sensing the vast patience and ancient wisdom of the dormant entities. Price concluded his report with news that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. 3. New species have requested admission to the Galactic Council. All 3 are civilizations that never developed high-energy technology, choosing instead to focus on sustainable development and internal growth. They offer perspectives on governance and philosophy that could benefit us all. The chamber buzzed, with quiet conversation as representatives discussed this development. For the first time in galactic history, primitive civilizations were being invited to join advanced societies as equals. The crisis had revealed that advancement wasn't always measured in energy output or technological complexity. As the session ended, Price reflected on the transformation that had swept across the galaxy. Humanity had not conquered their enemies or imposed their will through superior force. They had instead shown by example that there was another way to live, another path to follow that led to sustainability, rather than self-destruction. The memorial at the galactic core bore witness to this new understanding. Built from simple stone and metal, it stood in the heart of the entropy field network where the devourers slept. Pilgrims from hundreds of worlds came to read the inscription that had been carved in every known language. Here rest the ancient guardians, cosmic forces that maintain the balance between order and chaos. They sleep peacefully, watched over by those who learned that the greatest strength is knowing when to be still. May their dreams be quiet and their awakening distant, for in their sleep lies the galaxy's peace. Below the main inscription, smaller text told the story of humanity's vigil. When the galaxy burned in fear, one species stood silent and learned to listen. In that silence, they heard the deeper rhythms of existence and found the patience to wait for wisdom. Their gift to the galaxy was not conquest but comprehension, not victory but understanding. As Price walked through the council chambers toward his quarters, he passed groups of beings from different worlds sitting together, in quiet meditation, practicing the human art of productive stillness. Children of various species played games that emphasized patience over speed, cooperation over competition. Elderly beings shared stories in whispers that carried more weight than the loudest proclamations of the old days. The galaxy had learned to whisper, and in that whisper, it had found its voice. Humanity's greatest victory was not that they had saved galactic civilization, but that they had taught it to save itself. They had shown that survival sometimes required not fighting harder but thinking deeper, not running faster but waiting longer, not burning brighter but learning to find light in the gentle glow of sustainable existence. The Devourers still slept, at the galactic core, dreaming whatever dreams such ancient beings might have. And across 1,000 worlds, younger species learned the human art of living quietly enough to let them sleep undisturbed, maintaining the delicate balance that kept the galaxy safe and peaceful. In the end, humanity's silence had spoken louder than all the noise that had come before.